everybody. Welcome to this Daily Maverick webinar. I'm your host, Neesa Moodley, editor of Business Maverick, and we're talking today about the fact that the budget landed yesterday after a 3-week ago botched attempt. It was tabled before Parliament, but the question is what happens now? And even though it was tabled yesterday, there is still some concern over how it's going to go through, given that the DA has already raised objections. With me today to unpack these details is Rebecca Davis, senior journalist at Daily Maverick, and Tim Cohen, editor at large.
Hi, Neesa.
Hello. Hi.
So I think, Rebecca, let's kick off first with the parliamentary process. You wrote a really great piece today looking at what happens now.
So I think the first thing we all need to say up front, very, very frankly, is that this really is an unprecedented situation, and there will probably be questions from you, our wonderful viewers, that we cannot answer. And that is honestly because this just has never happened before. The situation of contestation as regards the budget and the political maneuverings around it and the timelines, etc. Everything is very, very up in the air. And trust me when I say we are scrambling to find answers as well, from tax experts, from legal historians, from the people who wrote the Constitution, from everyone. But here's what we know so far. So the way this normally happens in South Africa is fairly straightforward. The budget gets tabled, as happened yesterday. It moves to the parliamentary committees. Each portfolio discusses the elements of the budget that pertain to their department, and then it returns to the National Assembly for a vote. And this normally takes place over quite a protracted period, over, say, 2 months. And as things stand in the parliamentary timetable, this is all still laid down for May. So the eventual National Assembly vote, I think, is towards the end of May, and the parliamentary budget votes happen before then. How this is going to be impacted now by the situation of complete uncertainty about whether the budget can be legally passed remains to be seen.
Okay. Tim, do you want to weigh in with your introductory where you're at in terms of the unprecedented events? I mean, in 20 years of covering the budget, I've never seen chaos on this level.
No, that's right. I mean, it's just fascinating. If I understand it correctly, and I probably don't, so please don't hold me to this, but I think that it is feasible for government to go forward on a sort of month-by-month basis while the process is underway. So we're not like in a situation like in America, yes, where government has to close down. That's not going to happen in South Africa. But there are complications, as we were discussing before we came online, which is, what about all of the sin taxes which now sort of go up? Technically speaking, they're supposed to go up at the end of the month, but they won't have been passed by Parliament. So can they still do that? Do they have to delay them? This is one among a gazillion questions that the delay in the process asks you. But by the way, the most important variable here is whether or not the ANC actually has the votes, and we don't know that yet. And if they don't have the votes, then we are unprecedented now. Then we'll be more unprecedented. Then we'll be unprecedented on top of unprecedentedness, which will be really interesting.
Absolutely. And on that note, Rebecca, you also had some insights about the possible coalitions that could build going forward out of this to get those required votes.
Yeah, really interesting. Just to pick up on what one thing Tim was saying there, I think it is important to note that, we've all seen what happened in America over the past few years, where there's been these complete roadblocks in Senate and Congress, overspending bills, and then the whole government grinds to a halt. That's not going to happen in South Africa. Treasury officials have told us that whatever happens, there is enough money in the system for things to keep ticking along for several months, if necessary, maybe even a year. So we don't have to worry about that kind of political drama happening here, a complete freeze on all services and spending, even though some would say we'd hardly notice. Anyway, back to the votes in question. All right, so from what we can tell, and this is very tentative stuff because it was based on us sort of just canvassing party leaders directly after the budget to say, where do you stand on this? where it stands is tight, but the balance is in favor of against this budget. So as far as we can tell, there are something like, I'm just putting up, my colleague Pharaoh Hafji did a very, very good graphic on this. It is, I think, 200 and, where are we? 201 votes against the budget, right? So this is pretty much all the big parties other than the ANC. It's the DA, it's MK, it's EFF, it's Action South Africa, it's the Freedom Front Plus, and then it's the smaller parties, the parties that Helen Zille very unkindly calls rats and mice parties. So it's BOSA, it's ATM, etc. In favor of passing the budget currently, we believe, is obviously the ANC, the IFP, which is interesting because the IFP is part of the GNU and has, in the recent past, kind of aligned itself very closely with the DA on most of these sensitive matters. Here they seem to be saying, no, we'll run with the ANC on this one. And the Patriotic Alliance, which is also one of the major parties at the moment. Patriotic Alliance, as far as we can see, has said that they will throw their votes in alongside. So where does that leave things? 196 for, 201 against. In other words, as things stand, the ANC has to find 5 MPs at least that it can persuade into its corner. Is this impossible? No, of course not. If it could turn a party like Action SA, that's 6 votes, automatically that's done deal. But the interesting thing is that, you know, as always, there's a lot of politicking happening around this. And there was sort of, I felt, a kind of cascading effect where more and more parties just decided they would take against this budget, whether for high-minded principles or for political expediency, who can say, and that's up to them and their conscience. But as a result, what is almost certain is that the decisions made about this are not going to be just about the budget. They're not going to be just about VAT. They're going to be about what parties can get out of this, where it benefits them to stand in coalitions, etc. But I mean, who would have thought that we would see the day, guys, where basically the DA, the EFF, and MK would be aligned? Astonishing times.
Yeah. Can I just make a follow-up point there? And that is, you know, it's this whole question about whether or not the parties are acting as a kind of in a sort of vote-catching kind of way, or whether they're acting in principle. I just think that's a very fascinating question. I mean, I think it's and it's very difficult to tell. Because, you know, the ostensible reason why the DA is voting against this budget, we'll hear a bit more, by the way, just very soon, because they're having a press conference. But the ostensible reason they're doing it is because they weren't, the whole the government wasn't explicitly committed to making spending cuts this year. And one of the things that the DA wanted scrapped, or wanted looked at least, was South Africa's kind of training system, which a government has put an enormous amount of money into, and you know, really they're not getting very good results out of. But basically it's about savings. So the DA wants the savings program to be taken much more seriously than they felt government was, or that the ANC was in the kind of negotiations and discussions. And I think that's you know, whether you say the DA is justified or not depends quite a lot on whether you believe them and whether you support the idea of government saving more money. So now, personally, I'm in favor of government saving money on the basis that they blow such a lot. It's so obvious. But, you know, other people have got different views. What do you think, Rebecca?
Well, Tim, I've been interested in the DA stance on this too, because I think I've written before, it's genuinely impressive that the DA is taking this incredibly firm stance against VAT in the knowledge that it will affect all South Africans. This is the most democratic tax, right? At the same time, we know that Godongwana sort of, you know, he basically contorted himself not to raise income tax or to raise corporate tax, although we can talk about the the bracket creep issue in a second, maybe. But the point is, I would have to say that most of the DA constituents would be far more angered and affected by an increase in income tax and corporate tax than they would be by VAT. So, but from that perspective, well done to the DA for taking this pro-poor stance, if that is indeed what it's about. But Tim, what I wanted to ask you is something that a tax expert friend said to me this morning, which is that he thinks the outcry over VAT is grandstanding, because on the basis of the extension to the VAT neutral basket of goods, consumables, the kind of consumables that the 4 lowest economic percentiles do consume most of in this country, will actually be cheaper. So there is a sense, and this has been made by economists, that this is a pro-poor budget in the sense that extending that does sort of neutralize the VAT hike. What is your take on that?
I don't think, I'm in a slightly different mode. First of all, what happened between the first budget and the second budget was that group of goods that will now be VAT exempt was cut a bit. So the extension to the VAT exempt status of some of the basic food groups wasn't as extensive as it was set out in the aborted budget, and that sort of makes sense because the VAT increase is less. So I think government felt they didn't have to go as far down that road. But also it's a sort of like to take one example. In the first budget, if I understand this correctly, I think I do, chicken sales as a whole were put into the VAT-free category. And in this budget, it's only sort of the kind of offcuts, chicken offal, essentially, that is VAT-free. So, and they had to do that because, underlying all of these issues is an absolutely overriding thing that we don't talk about enough, which is that governments run out of money. They've just run out of money, and they keep running out of money, and they keep every year. There's a big hole in the budget that they have to fill in a kind of emergency fashion, and that's basically what happened this year. Was that there was 2 things happened this year. First of all, the ANC passed a whole bunch of legislation which requires spending increases, and they were expecting growth to come in higher than it did. And both of those things meant that there was yet another 50 billion plus hole in the budget that they had to fill. So now what they've done this time is that they've, instead of putting up VAT by 2 percentage points in one go, they're putting VAT up by 0.5 percentage point now, and then another 0.5 percentage point next year. And then they've kind of done a little fiddle with Eskom. So there was going to be some debt relief for Eskom, and they're just not doing that this year. And in that way, they filled the sort of budget hole. But what they haven't done is they haven't actually, although there was a large portion of the speech which was about cost savings. There are minuscule cost savings this year. So basically everything just carries on as it was. Yeah. Does that sort of make sense? I just complicated matters further.
No, I was interested to see from your, as always, excellent newsletter last night after the bell, that one of the few places they have cut staff costs was the Department of Home Affairs, if I read that correctly.
Yes, that's right. I mean, it is extraordinary. I mean, that's the only one. That's the only, sort of, it's not really, they didn't break it down by department, but it's really by function. And that's the only function that has changed between the first budget and the second one, the aborted budget and the actual one. But anyway,
I mean, it's interesting to think about that from the political perspective. Is this because the wonderful GNU Minister Leon Schreiber has succeeded in automating so many processes that they can just casually dispense with workers, or is it a kind of, I don't know. a dig, in fact, at the wonderful DNU Minister Leon Schreiber, that he will have to absorb this cost cutting where other departments won't. But Tim, if I might, we've had a question here, quite a pointed question, if I might say, from Busi Moletsane, saying, are you going to discuss the proposed budget? Thank you for keeping us on track, Busi. So Tim, I mean, you've outlined a number of the eye-catching features, but is there anything else that really struck you as kind of novel or hitting consumers particularly hard about this budget, the details of it?
Well, no, I mean, in some ways, that's what kind of worries me, is that it seems like there's the budget that, not a lot of thought has gone into it, because, if you, from the kind of consumer side, from the voter side, right? You just don't see a lot of action on that front. There weren't any specific cuts to existing, programs. All of the program side of the budget seemed to go on. The two things that I think really stood out were actually not about, us as, citizens. They were about business. And there was like the whole idea of getting business involved and doing public-private partnerships and all of those kinds of things. We've heard about this for ages and ages, but it really was emphasized this time. I mean, I don't know what you think, or Neesa, I don't know what you think, but it did seem to me that had even more emphasis. There was, I mean, I would say there was a kind of element of desperation about it, sort of like, please, business, come and help, get involved,
if we put it in the budget speech, you have to come on board. But it was interesting. There was definitely an emphasis on SOEs, and I think it was nice to see Eskom's bailout being reduced from 70 billion to 50 billion. So that claws back 20 billion, but it's still nowhere near where we need to be. In terms of the impact for taxpayers, Rebecca, the man on the street, I think the fact that the tax brackets have not been adjusted for inflation means technically, you're going to come to the less this year, and they've had that policy since 2023. So I would have thought, and there was no increase in tax-free savings allowance has not been increased. The exemption amounts for different taxes have not been increased. So although they are not directly penalizing you, there are definitely implications for the taxpayer in terms of getting the short end of the stick, I should say. Tim, sorry, I lost connection there. I must apologize to you and the viewers. But how does the VAT increase affect the ordinary man on the street? There's been a lot of debate about whether it does and it doesn't, and does it affect the higher consumer or the lower consumer? What are your thoughts?
Well, there's a big debate about this amongst economists, because, there was, part of the interregnum between the budgets, was taken up by this debate about the notion of a regressive taxation system. So a regressive taxation system is where you are taxing your lowest income earners disproportionately to your highest income earners, or perhaps not even disproportionately. You're just not taxing them proportionately. And that's what VAT does, technically. Technically speaking, the biggest, the richer you are, the smaller proportion of your total income you're spending on consumption. So that doesn't apply to me for two reasons. First of all, because I'm not in the rich category, and secondly, because I seem to spend everything that I earn instantly. So, but theoretically, at least, rich people, set aside money for investments and for pensions and all of those sorts of things. So they're not as affected proportionally as poor people are, who typically live from month to month, right? And who spend everything that they earn, if they are.
And then in terms of, Rebecca, I know you addressed, it's almost like Leon Schreiber was so effective, he's removed the need for himself, which they say in business school is something you should worry about. But I wanted to ask, and I'm sure a lot of viewers and readers have the same question, surely there's room to cut costs in terms of our bloated cabinet, because it feels like we came into the year and they've been trying to make every party happy. So we've got all kinds of people there that shouldn't be there. So is that not an opportune time
100%.
to shrink it?
It should be. But we all know that the GNU is the end result of enormous political compromise. And one of them was that basically the Cyril Ramaphosa had to hand out jobs like sweeties to members of the former opposition as well. And also noticeable that there hasn't been much bleating from the likes of the DA about cabinet size ever since, because it is nice to be there in government. It is also interesting, by the way, that the Western Cape government is currently introducing proposed legislation to expand the number of MPs in their provincial legislature, which has caused a lot of pushback from the likes of the Good Party. I mean, the argument is that, you know, Cape Town is expanding so massively that you do require more elected representatives. But it just does not seem that the political moment is one of cutting back in that way. And as you said, is one of the most obvious forms. But if I might turn it back to you two for a second, I see this comment coming in from Emerson, and I've heard it so much, and I've seen columns about it, etc., about what South Africa needs is Doge. South Africa needs its own Department of Government Efficiency, just like Elon Musk and his little tech bros have brought in the States to come in with chainsaws and start slashing. I mean, one can obviously understand the appeal of that in a country like South Africa, but is it feasible to transport that kind of a model onto our very different developmental state?
Well, I mean, I think
right off the bat, I'd say sorry, Tim.
No, sorry, Neesa, go ahead.
I was going to say right off the bat, if we did have a Doge, I'd nominate Edward Kieswetter to run it, because I think he's shown at SARS he's quite efficient at chopping and slashing costs and making things as efficient as possible. So yeah, okay, over to you.
No, I was just going to make a point about it's sort of related about the size of cabinet. You know, in some ways, the cabinet is the most visible problem because we just seem to have so many ministries that, you know, honestly, I mean, I've always wanted to know, what does the Deputy Minister of Arts and Culture actually do? You know, what does the day consist of? I mean, you're not even the minister, you know. Do you go and see plays? I mean, what do you actually do? You know, but the actual problem is really the size of cabinet is comparatively de minimis if compared to some other very big things, and one of them is the SOEs in South Africa have just gone nuts. They have just gone nuts. And, you know, so very big government agencies, like, you know, the one that I've had a lot of interaction with recently is the Road Accident Fund. You know, the CEO of the Road Accident Fund gets paid $1 million a month. You know, this is basically a bankrupt organization. It's dead. The thing is dead. You know, and he's getting paid $1 million a month. Whereas Barbara Creasy gets paid, what, Rebecca, $3 million a year, right? So, you know, and there are a zillion of those. The board members and execs of PRASA, you know, they are massively out earning the president, you know, which, and if you add all of those, and, you know, there's 600 government SOEs, right? 600. So, you know, just to apply some maths to that, and you get to quite a frightening number. So, you know, I don't think we need Doge. We don't, you know, Doge is more about closing down, you know, a whole kind of, you know, essential things that you know, most governments would, you know, consider essential. But that doesn't mean to say that there aren't big payments to be made. And just on the payments question, you know, I did a little bit of research, and you can't really call it research. I mean, I looked on the internet and discovered there was a bunch of things that I think are eminently questionable, and that really we're not getting a very good return on. You know, one of them is the money that we pay South Africa's neighboring states for because we have this sort of internal trade deal, we compensate them for a lack of and this is called the SACU payments. And SACU payments went up this year, you know, to 70 billion. You know, from 50 billion. I mean, they went up 20 billion in 1 year. You know, And it's sort of like, and they were all designed because Botswana is such a poor country, and Namibia is such a poor country. But now basically, the average Namibian and the average Botswana is richer than the average South African. So why we are, and we've just been locked into this thing that it existed way back in apartheid times, and so there's lots of programs like that, and actually the finance minister Enoch Godongwana, he did mention this. He did sort of say in his kind of promise about how government will address cabinet overspend. He specifically said that there is this problem that everything just goes up incrementally year after year after year, and nobody asks themselves the hard question: is this actually delivering? Is this doing anything? And so he says there've been hundreds of spending reviews have taken place, which is true. There have been hundreds of spending reviews. So I think you mentioned there've been 200 spending reviews. But the problem is that nobody's implemented any of them. So it's pointless doing a spending review.
Pointless having the review.
Somebody has to decide, make a kind of hard and rational decision about whether or not this is worth paying money for.
And then Nick and Carlo, two of our viewers, have the same question, and I think I also love to know your thoughts, both of you. Did you see anything in this budget that actually addresses growth, which is our big problem, growth and unemployment? Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I saw some of the banker responses that I saw said it wasn't a growth budget. You wouldn't describe this as a growth budget, except in the sense that there's more dedication to infrastructure spend, and that and infrastructure spend hasn't been cut back. So you could call it, and also there is this, public-private partnership sort of idea, and the more involvement from the private sector, all of those sorts of things. They are sort of, pro-government pro-growth in a sort of broad sense. But I wouldn't describe this as a growth budget. I think that the commentary that I read it just struck me when I read it as too optimistic. Because the other thing is, so South Africa is going to come in now this year with 0.9% growth, maybe. The budget assumes that economic growth is going to be 1.9% next year. Well, if you add a whole new layer of taxes, that starts to look a little bit questionable. I would say we would be very lucky if we see 1.9, whereas previously I was kind of dubiously confident. Now I'm more, skeptical about that 1.9 percentage increase, GDP increase. And these things, these are sort of huge numbers, right? So, 1.9% growth. That's still below population growth, by the way. So it still means we're going backwards, by the way. But still, it would be 1.9% would be, double what South Africa's got over the past decade on average. So, I think it's pretty hopeful.
Neesa, on the note of employment and tackling unemployment, there were some features there. There was an 8.8 billion for public employment programs. What concerned me was 22 billion rand for job creation programs, but it seemed that was either going to be administered by or coming from the Unemployment Insurance Fund, which we know is beset with problems. So just the mention of the UIF concerns me. Having said that, Kasatu felt like these were, reasonably progressive measures in terms of addressing unemployment. But I must say, the one obvious thing that comes up every year is about the very bloated civil service wage bill, right? And I was wondering going into this year's budget if the ANC might not sort of use the GNU as a kind of pretext to cut some of that, because the narrative in the past has always been basically that the ANC can't cut the civil service because, first of all, unemployment is so bad, but second of all, because the market, the political market, so to speak, would then be flooded with these aggrieved voters who would take it out on the ANC, who was previously their major employer. I had wondered if the ANC could use the GNU as a sort of pretext to say, well, you know, new dawn, it's not just us in power, so we're not the ones making the decisions. Look at our friends in the DA over there, they're with us here. And as a result, we are going to make these sweeping cuts. That obviously didn't happen. And again, you know, South Africa is not the US. We are a developmental state. We have huge unemployment crisis, etc. So these aren't decisions that can just be chainsawed like is happening in Argentina as well. But yeah, I just thought, you know, it really was business as usual when it comes to the budget. There was no indication for me, I don't know if you guys feel differently, that this was taking place in this unprecedented political landscape of the GNU.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was also surprised that you know, there is a negotiations process with the public service unions, so presumably they had to kind of respect that a bit. And but still, you know, if you benchmark South Africa, South Africa is paying, particularly, you know, senior civil servants, really extraordinarily good salaries by comparison with the public sector, and really not getting very much, you know, not getting the kind of mileage out of it that you would hope, right? And that's because, you know, there's just sort of mountainous nepotism and cadre deployment. You know, I mean, that hasn't gone away as far as I can tell. I mean, I just don't see, you know, it's very interesting. We were talking about Leon Schreiber a little bit earlier, but it is incredible what a you know, an active, thoughtful, creative, engaged minister can do. You know, it's just and it is and you know, you don't see a lot of that. You know, and we're paying these people a lot of money, you know, and not only the ministers, but also the, you know, the senior peoples within the department. So I mean, I wish there was a way around this that we could, you know, find a way of reducing our expenditure on the public sector at the same time as improving the quality of it, you know, without in a way that doesn't have such potent political, you know, effects that it endangers the, you know, the government's, because at the moment all the leverage is on the side of the public servants, and you know, in a sense, the outcome this year, where everybody's salary goes up by more than inflation, almost double the current inflation rate, is an example of that.
Yeah. And then in terms of just, I thought it was interesting that a lot of money is being thrown SARS, right? Well, not a lot of money, 8 billion being thrown to SARS to improve efficiency. But Rebecca, I think you're well placed to answer this one, because my feeling is it's pointless throwing more money at SARS to make the tax collection more efficient if all the revenue that's being collected is then misspent and almost looted on the other side. Surely we're not addressing the problem, we're just increasing it. I
mean, as you say, can you imagine being Edward Kieswetter, who does appear to be like a highly efficient, process-based man, systems-based, cleaning stuff up. You do all this to claw back additional billions, and then you just see it, you know, wasted on some swimming pool in Limpopo that never comes to fruition, or whatever. It's got to be agonizing. I mean, that is self-evidently true, everything you've just said. I thought it was interesting. Cosatu's statement on the matter declared themselves deeply irritated, quote unquote, which is quite a strangely sort of emotional response to, but deeply irritated by SARS getting more money, because their point was, you know, SARS has plenty of money and is doing fine with the money it has. But the other thing which Tim pointed out was that very interesting little nugget dropped in there about how they've identified 155, I think, thousand kind of super rich people, or you know, high net worth, shall we say, people who are not filing their taxes. Which is really something, because there is this overwhelming narrative about, you know, the beleaguered taxpayer in this country, and, you know, you can't possibly raise taxes or everyone rich will leave, and, you know, we're carrying the burden of this country. And it is very clear that there are hundreds of thousands of people who are massively financially benefiting from South Africa and simply not paying taxes. I mean, that is something that alone is surely vindication for additional resources to SARS.
Yeah, can I make a point here?
Yeah, Tim.
I mean, it's just that little nugget was interesting to me too, because you know, Kesvina's argument, you know, there's an interesting divergence has emerged between SARS and the Treasury. And you know, and we know about it because of that live mic moment, which is just like the best. You know, if there ever was a god of journalism, it would be the god of live mics. You know, Kesvina's solution to the problem of South Africa missing its revenue targets is to put more money into SARS. You know, and I think he's got a point. I mean, you know, if you just look at, you know, there's a lot of examples of this, but there is an extraordinary underground. It's not just high net worth individuals. There's an extraordinary underground economy in South Africa, and you just know that people just don't pay tax, and you know it because the deposits into bank accounts, for example, you know, people depositing, you know, anything between 15 and 25,000 rand a month, which basically means, you know, that they're running businesses. You know, if it's a variable amount, you can tell. So the bankers know how much action there is happening at a local level, and it's a lot. And there's a sort of standard rule in the you know, in the underground economy, and that is stay underground. You know, so and you know, I've always thought that, you know, that really it's important to focus obviously on the high net worth people who are not paying, because, you know, it's really irritating if people who get the gift of enormous wealth, you know, don't give some of it back. You know, and everybody agrees on that. But there's also this other aspect of South Africa's underground economy where people just don't see the advantage or the utility, or they're just getting away with it, so they don't bother with it, of registering and paying tax. And you know, it's possible that this is, from an economic point of view, this is actually a good thing. You know, you could argue that this is actually a kind of good thing, because it means that a lot of very small businesses, you know, will be you know, in a profitable position, right? Whereas they might not be if they had to register and pay, you know, VAT and SARS, and, you know, do all the compliance and all of that sort of stuff. But it does mean that you know, gradually the kind of the social network that is theoretically holds the whole economy together gets more and more frayed, and that is very obvious in South Africa now.
Absolutely. So I think if the viewers watch out, there's a poll question coming up in the chat box. If you're a finance minister for a day, where would you find the extra 28 billion instead of increasing VAT? And you've got 5 options: cutting government perks, reducing the bloated public service wage bill, selling off SA and Eskom assets, increasing sin taxes, and taxing the super rich more aggressively. So please do vote on the poll so we can see what you, the viewers, have to say in terms of what do you think? Tim, you've mentioned, and you've written a column about, I think you outlined 3 to 5 different alternatives to the VAT increase.
Yes. So one of them I've already mentioned, which is the South African Customs Union payments, which are, you know, really just enormous. The other one that I spoke about, you know, which is, we've also spoken about a little bit, but and that is how government agencies, there doesn't seem to be a sense of control of how government agencies you know, finance their own executive wage bills. You know, I mean, you know, just to be fair, right? It's true of the private sector too, because you know, however much government ministers are being paid. There's there's a whole bunch of people in the private sector who I think are also being massively overpaid. But anyway, that's a sort of separate issue. And then the other one was the training budget, South Africa's overall training budget. And actually, interestingly, if you read if there was a reference to this when Minister Gonagata was talking about places where they are going to examine for cost cuts, these kind of job assistance programs, whether there was overlap and duplication and that sort of stuff, was one of the areas that they're thinking about. So I think there is a sort of growing consensus on that question. There are things like, there is something a program which I really think is good, which is called the EPWP, which is a sort of twice a week. They sort of hire people massively below minimum wage, by the way, just to do some work and pay for it. So, I don't think it's a terrible program, but, is it effective? It's a
Tim, if I might, having traveled a bit in actually near where you live in the Karoo, for instance, you can really see how the EPWP program keeps those communities alive. Those jobs are sort of rotated, and yes, they don't turn into anything. They don't become jobs, and I don't think you can probably parlay that experience into like a wonderful LinkedIn profile, but they literally keep food on families' tables. That program has been studied internationally. I remember visiting delegations from places in Europe with high youth unemployment like Spain and Greece coming to South Africa to study that program. It's considered international best practice. But also on something you said, Tim, and you said this sort of flippantly, but it's not an obvious point on my part, but it is true. There is a non-trivial link between the bloated salaries of the private sector and obviously the bloated salaries they have to pay in government. And that is because to try to attract anywhere near the brightest and best to government, the kind of people we would want in those positions, they have to compete with the private sector. If only there was some kind of wage cap on the private sector, that would do wonders. And you see this all the time. I was just reading at my son's government school. One of the teachers has just resigned, presumably to go on to a much better paying post in a private school. Like those of us who depend on government services to some degree, I think, are to some degree in favor of paying higher salaries for certain posts in terms of the fact that, we can't be sending our kids to private schools, whatever. I'd rather have my teacher at a government school earn a decent wage and be able to get a higher caliber of person. So, we can't have these discussions just sort of, let's cut all the civil servants, etc. You might be thinking of, some lazy person at Home Affairs. I'm thinking of my son's grade art teacher.
Yes, no, I understand. Yeah. No, true. And there's two other things that we haven't sort of mentioned, and that is the COVID grant, which is being extended, and so this is what it's 340 Rand a month to 16 million people, right? It's a very widespread, social program. And, it's clear to me the Treasury doesn't like it, which is so weird because I think it's a great program. I think they should extend it. I would be very happy if all government did was take money from, take a little bit of money from spending and from, corporate taxes and personal taxes and just hand it out. So there would be no one in government doing anything. There would just be a transfer of wealth. There would be no employees. It would be automatic. Is that ridiculous? It is ridiculous.
Tim, what do we call this political philosophy? Because it's like libertarianism unhinged. I don't know what to call it.
but you know what I mean? Just as an illustration for why that program, does make sense. It's a program to build on, and in the same way that the EPWP gets helps communities. The COVID grant, I'm calling it the COVID grant. What do I mean? It's the
SRD grant.
SRD grant here. That just basically takes away, malnutrition. And I like it. So I don't understand why the Treasury's kind of very said, "Oh, I don't know whether we're going to extend this or not." You know, we'll try if we can. The other thing that we haven't mentioned, there's two other things that we haven't mentioned, and that is the NHI and the Bella Bill. The Bella Bill's relevant because it's theoretically it makes grade R, this is preschool, a program of government, and NHI is obviously the attempt to turn South Africa's private healthcare system into a public one, both of which are enormously expensive. And you know, I cannot tell you how, you know, to me, both of them are just pure virtue signaling. I mean, they just appall me. I'm just so angry about them because it's so obvious that we need them. No one says we don't need them, for God's sake. But is now the time to do both of them? You know, simultaneously, it just says to you something about the kind of mentality of government. We'll just pass the program, we'll just make the law, and then the money will suddenly, you know, appear out of nowhere. It'll just arrive. You know, and that is not how to budget. That is not a budgeting process. That is a dream, you know, that is a fantasy, you know. So, you know, so obviously NHI is probably not going to happen now. So, but, you know, because
as I understand it, that is the political price for the GNU. That is the price for the GNU. That is the way for the ANC to allay all those doubters who said, why are you getting into bed with white monopoly capitalists? This is their way, by saying, look, here are these bills. We are sticking to our revolutionary mandate. If you don't like NHI and Bella, then perhaps you must make do with an ANC majority government, because that's what the GNU costs.
Well, is that true though? Isn't it the opposite? Isn't it? Because these are okay. So you say this satisfies the ANC's left wing, right? The passing of the Bella Bill and the NHI are the measures that make it possible for the ANC to go into alliance with its right wing by satisfying the programs of the left wing, right? So that's the kind of logic. But the problem is that now that they are now that they have this government of national unity with their right wing, their own partners are against their own programs. You know, they've basically allowed the people who are against their own programs into government. So now the programs are not going to be implemented, or they're going to be half implemented, so the ANC is not going to satisfy its left wing because the programs are not going to happen unless you believe that, you know, that these are just gestures. You know, it's not a solution. I don't think it is the price. Because I think the ANC would have had to have gone into coalition with one or other of the parties anyway. So there was no need for them to make the economic situation just impossible by passing legislation that is unfinanceable.
Also, I think on that point, the NHI and the Bella Bill predate the GNU by several years. So those are
they do, but there was a flurry of. But it was to Tim's point that the coincidence of these things, like why now when we have so little money? But yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you've said, Tim. It's just that, and you're right that this may just be gestures. You know, they do keep seeming to push various things for touch when it comes to implementation, etc.
Yeah. But maybe you're right too. Maybe the fact that the NHI bill has been now put into practice means that the ANC won't lose as many votes to the left wing as that they might have already. You know,
that's their hope, I guess.
You know, so we're slightly up in the air here. Anyway.
So, and then we've got the results of the poll that was in the chat group. 41% of you said cut government perks. I agree. 37% said reduce the public service wage bill. Yes. 14% said sell off the struggling SOE assets. 7% said tax the super rich more aggressively. I'm on board with all of that. And I have to say, true South African style, only 1% wanted an increase in sin taxes. You know, we love to drink and smoke. I don't personally, but South Africans definitely know where their bread is buttered. That was
Yes.
quite funny.
Sin is us. That is unquestionably true.
So we've got just 10 minutes left. Do you want to round up? Rebecca, I'm unfortunately lost a few minutes at the beginning there with my internet connection. Did you resolve, or did we come to a conclusion on, you know, I think there was a very interesting point that came up where if government doesn't agree on the budget, there is some kind of idea where there could be a motion of no confidence, and that
they could, and that is
yeah. Does that mean they could? And if it's a GNU, because you can't get the government just if it's a GNU, then does that mean it would just be a motion of no confidence in Cyril? And
so. Look, that is the absolute sort of most outlandish scenario, which is that we get to the date of the vote. There is still, the ANC still doesn't have the votes to carry it over. It has not made whatever horrifying deals we might speculate about behind the scenes to carry it over. That is really unlikely, I think, because also the point to be made is that Parliament can amend the bill, right? And that's obviously what the ANC, the budget. So that's what the DA is hoping for now, that with sufficient political pressure, they will be able to either persuade a different approach on VAT, or, I don't know, I suppose, concede to the VAT, but in exchange for movement on various other key pieces of legislation, the contentious ones that we've been discussing today, and the Land Expropriation Act. That's all possible. That's the most likely scenario, is that the budget gets amended in a way that somehow allows everyone to save face. But the bigger question, Neesa, is what this all says about the GNU, and it's nothing very good, right? For one of the things is that Cyril Ramaphosa, our dear president, was adamant before the time, and maybe this was, you know, just sort of putting a brave face in it, but he was adamant that everything was under control. He had the full support this time around of his GNU partners. That was definitely not the case. And the question is, what happened? Is it that, you know, Cyril and his famous deal-making negotiation skills have let him down? Is it simply that he's distracted? I mean, there is so much going on with this nonsense in the US. He's currently on a state visit to Angola, I think. Is he simply dropping the ball a bit when it comes to these, you know, kind of small but vital, these detailed legislative matters back at home? And what does it say about the position of parties like the DA in the GNU if they simply cannot apparently use their influence to get the outcomes they want? They have a deputy finance minister. Ashok Sarapen is the DA deputy finance minister. He would have been in all the rooms where the budget was discussed, yet clearly could not make sufficient inroads to get the DA's perspective across. The same goes for cabinet. They discussed this budget in cabinet. The DA has how many? At least three or four cabinet ministers. They apparently also were unable to make inroads. So they are going to have to do some hard questioning about their positions in the GNU. Is it worth it to be part of a table where their inputs are not seriously taken on board?
Neesa, can I ask Rebecca a question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Sure. Go for it.
No, I was just wondering about this scenario, right? What if the DA doesn't vote against the budget, but just abstains?
So you brought this up yesterday, and it was a really good point, except that they've sort of categorically said that they're not, what they said was that the ANC will not get its majority, basically, without us, and that the ANC needs a majority. So it seemed like they were actually going to vote against it. But otherwise, I agree that would have been an interesting scenario.
Because in some senses, you could say they did get something of what they wanted.
They did, yeah.
Because they got a decrease in the VAT rate, a big one. I mean, it's you know, it's 75% lower than what it was. So you know they can chalk that one up, isn't it? And they also got a commitment to to spending review. I mean,
that's what one of our political colleagues said, that in a way the DA is going to look a little bit silly if it blows up the GNU over 0.5% tax VAT hike, considering that is such a substantial reduction from what was initially on the table.
So you're both talking about 0.5%, but I think it is actually we should be talking about 1%, because technically it's a 1% staggered over 2 years.
You're right.
So yeah.
Can I ask Rebecca another question?
Tim,
Rebecca is the hot seat.
Who do you think, as on the ground, who has won politically out of this whole process?
Well,
So
this
if
is
you
my
had to
thing.
do a poll before the vote and after the vote, whose votes went up, would you guess?
Well, I don't think that anyone wants that increased, right? This is the thing. There's no world in which the ANC's core supporters, are sitting there going, that's right. Well done,
Yes.
you raising the price of these basic goods. I mean, that's nonsensical. At the same time, as I've said, the DA's core constituents are people who are obviously very averse to tax increases of any kind. So from that perspective, they may well say, well done you. But at the same time, the tax increases they're most averse to are definitely income tax and corporate tax and wealth tax and the rest of it rather than VAT. Would, for instance, the Patriotic Alliance's constituencies be happy that they're like, okay, we're going along with that? It's very confusing. And I think it's very hard to see if there's any clear winners here. I mean, I think that if there's a loser, it's probably the ANC, but for the rest of it,
Wouldn't MK, isn't it a winning scenario for MK and the EFF? Isn't it sort of, because it just shows how, useless the government is. The ANC is their target. They might be the winners out of this process.
I think the whole GNU opposition stands to benefit, and we've seen Action SA making mileage of it from that perspective. Like, look at the GNU; they don't know what they're doing, and also they're anti-poor, and that. So from that perspective, just like GNU shambles, doesn't know what it's doing, and also hates the poor. Yeah, opposition wins, I guess.
Yeah.
So I think we've got like 4 minutes left. I want to round up by saying thank you both for being part of this very interesting, lively discussion this morning. I'm not sure if our viewers are going away with more questions or more answers. Unfortunately, due to the, as Tim said at the beginning, the unprecedented situation, we don't have all the answers, but it's nice to get all these things out in the open and start talking about them. I think that's how we get somewhere. I'd like to end by saying, from my, I think I really feel, the person I really feel for is Enoch Godongwana, because the poor man came to budget 3 weeks ago, and he sat down and he told the journalists in the pre-budget speech briefing, he said, he warned us. He said, this is an unprecedented situation. I've never done a coalition budget before. I'm used to coming here with the budget that has been accepted and approved, and I know it's going to go through. And this one, I don't know, there might be a bit of back and forth. He warned us. And then this week, he came in on Wednesday in the morning, and he said, I was chatting to the SARS commissioner this morning, and I said, I'm definitely going to table a budget today. And then only 5 minutes after he started speaking, there was the DA saying, we will not accept this increase. So yeah, you've got to feel for him. I think no matter what he does, he's been between a rock and a hard place, and he's never going to make all of them happy. And yeah, unfortunately, he's the one that's got to do it.
Absolutely.
All righty. Well, thank you very much. And this has been a fun discussion. Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed it, of course, as always.